thank you for the invite. I guess I'll try to share some slides, right? I'll do that, see if it works. And please let me know if things are not working. That's always better. But this you should be seeing now. And I'm going full screen here. Everything going all right there?
Yes.
Well, great. Good to hear. So then I'll start this formally by saying, dear fellow Nordic scholars of tourism studies, it is indeed an honor to be invited to address you at the opening of this annual symposium, of which I have been a part indeed since 2006, although I haven't been able to attend every single one. Peter Björk has the winnings on that one, I think. Now, I'm happy to be speaking to you about how to shape our mobile futures in times that are now commonly perceived as rather precarious, or even in a state of emergency. Here, I am not referring to COVID, but to the climate and biodiversity crisis we are in. Today, I want to talk about how this particular future perfect, with a question mark. Here I am employing the grammatical meaning, where future perfect is a verb tense used for actions that will be completed, that is finished or perfected, before some other point in the future. The question mark then is simply asking which actions will those be that will make for said future? Or vexing a little more philosophically, what are the conditions for the presencing of the future? Now, I want to claim that these presencing actions need to be derived from earthly attachments. That is, the earth is the conditional of the future perfect. And here I want to focus on how tourism can cultivate attachments to and understandings of the earth. So this presentation here will be in 3 parts. The first part will focus on the promise of tourism, as most generally understood around delivering growth and prosperity, as we heard, for instance, from the words of the minister. The second part will delve into why this promise is untenable and moreover ill-advisable, leading to ruin. And the last of the 3 parts of this presentation will then look at how we can reconfigure this promise around notions of conviviality and reciprocity. The examples I use to illustrate these thoughts are drawn from my latest book, published in April this year, and of course I'm happy to share with you upon request. So let us start with what I've labeled in other contexts the promise of tourism. To most, this entails growth, prosperity, and opportunity. At least this is how tourism is invariably promoted in policy and rhetorics worldwide, and we have numerous examples from the Nordic realm. In the global scheme of things, this is neatly captured in the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the associated goals. For tourism, indeed, the particular goals of economic growth, responsible production and consumption, and life below water have been highlighted. But in actual fact, according to the World Tourism Organizations and the United Nations Development Programme, tourism industries play a vital role in all 17 of the Sustainable Development Goals. Even the World Bank has jumped on the bandwagon, celebrating tourism as a tool for the economic development, highlighting how it contributes to economic growth, employment and poverty reduction, efficient use of resources, valuing diversity, and contributing to peace building. And tourism is indeed high on the agenda, if only allowed to grow. At the same time, tourism has been taken up by the eminent Marxian geographer David Harvey. He uses it as a prime example of the madness of our economic reasoning. Now, he starts off by explaining the fundamentals of this madness resting on the perpetual expansion of surplus value production. As he explains, since the origin of profit lie in surplus value production, then the process of valorization has a built-in incentive to continue indefinitely on the basis of perpetual exploitation of living labor in production. The implication, however, is a perpetual expansion of surplus value production. The circle of reproduction of capital becomes a spiral of perpetual growth and expansion. But more importantly, David Harvey adds, Any slowdown of value in motion entails a loss of value. Conversely, accelerating the turnover time of capital is a vital feature for enhancing value production. And here is where tourism comes in. To Harvey, it represents the idea of planned obsolescence gone instantaneous. You know this idea of household appliances and gadgetry designed to break after always shorter and shorter time, so you buy more? Obsolescence is built into our everyday life to an ever greater extent. Anyone with a smartphone knows how these tools are in ever more need for updates and, of course, new replacements. Well, with tourism, once the experience is consumed, it is gone and you need more. So it represents the ultimate way to accelerate the turnover time of capital. Just make an experience of everything, pack them up tightly. And of course, that's what's happening, to the extent that our very life is becoming a fictitious commodity through ubiquitous connectivity, as my colleague Ugo Rossi would have it. As he explains, in this context, the emergence of consumption as a privileged site for the fabrication of self and society, of culture and identity, as well as the blurring of conventional production to consumption dichotomies through the co-creation of commodities with consumers, has led to a profound metamorphosis of capitalism in Western societies. A profound metamorphosis indeed. The beast that is us, that you see there on the right. The same metamorphizing beast is in evidence when it comes to the UN Sustainability Development Goals. As Bianchi and de Man state in a recent issue in the Journal of Sustainable Tourism, in its belief that sustainability can be reconciled with growth-led inclusive market capitalism, the UNWTO's proposed revisions to the Sustainable Development Goals number 8 and its broader sustainability agenda remain blind to the injustices that are intrinsic to the systemic processes of exploitation characteristic of tourism capitalism. The horizons of inclusiveness envisioned in their agenda is reliant upon the market to deliver wealth redistribution through sustainable growth. This leaves unaddressed the question of widening and deepening democratic and cooperative forms of ownership, the control and use of productive assets, including the workplace itself, and the potential for fomenting diverse arrangements of tourism production, thus naturalizing capitalist property relations and inequalities in the distribution of resources. Our economic logic, global policy making, and the very way we aspire to well-being in the everyday entails growth, which is a core element of capitalist functioning and is being unquestioned in promoting tourism worldwide. And tourism grows year on year. Every year more people travel, ever further, ever more frequently. So that tourism has become emblematic of what researchers affiliated to the Stockholm Resilience Center call the Great Acceleration, characterizing our post-war economies. This acceleration of all production manifest in the socio-economic trends on the left have their impacts on Earth system trends in green on the right. All trends have assumed a hockey stick shape made famous by the climate scientist Michael Mann in terms of atmospheric CO2. And international tourism arrivals are indeed have assumed that shape. And there is nothing to indicate that COVID will change this. As in recent tourism crisis before, temporary dips can be recorded in retrospect, but growth will resume with a vengeance, not least because of non-discriminatory blanket state subsidies to the industries globally, tourism industry. Now, I remain very concerned about the Earth system impacts of the growth madness of our economic reasoning. Growth is leaving our planet in ruins, making the classic promise of tourism untenable and, moreover, ill-advisable. So, obviously not alone, and building on a long legacy of doubts about indefinite growth, with my colleague Martin Gren in Kalmar, I have thought about how the Earth is responding to this, how it speaks back. Now, the Earth obviously does not speak back as such. It is not your standard subject of correspondence or any type of inquiry. As Martin put it in his PhD some time ago, neither the description of the social, that is graphine or meaning, nor the description of the physical, geo, matter, can be reduced to the other. But in the abductive step of laying them side by side, another form of representation may emerge. Now, you might know Escher, MC Escher, that Dutch guy who makes those mind-bending pictures where everything seems to loop into each other. Here, indeed, the writing hands, making each other's as they write. Or in other words, how the earth makes for us as we make for the earth. All our descriptions are of this earth and make for the earth and for us at the same time. And that is how the earth speaks. Through us, so to speak. Now, the trick then is not trying to see that from above or even from below, but through the very practices of doing and being. Now, on the grandest scale of things, that is the planetary, when it comes to the climate and biodiversity crisis, we are said to live in a new geological era. An era labeled after humankind itself, the Anthropos. We hereby have the Anthropocene, representing a move beyond the geological conditions of the so-called Holocene, characteristic of the 10 to 12,000 years since the end of the last glacial epoch. This is a move into a novel epoch, whose signature is irreversible human impact on Earth and life processes. Now, as hackneyed and cliched the term Anthropocene might have become, in the wealth of publications now surrounding our man-made Earth, not least for, of course, assigning those transformations to all humankind regardless. However, the Anthropocene does send a powerful message. A message of how in the Anthropocene, the Earth may become both a subject which underpins and makes for the Anthropos, and at the same time an object which is before it and may be set against its earthly undertakings. Integral to understanding the Anthropocene is thus a realization of the objective and subjective geo-agency of the Earth system, or Gaia, and to be attuned to the way in which it talks back and communicating this among disciplines. So the big question me and Martin Gren are posing here is how to register or record the subjective geo-agency of the Earth system and hearing it talk back. Our tools for sensing, measuring, and making visible play a key role here. When it comes to the Anthropocene, a key transformation being wrought by certain parts of humanity is climate change. Here we can hear the Earth and speculate on the future based on ice core samples from the Antarctic spanning some 800,000 years. Here we see two lines. The upper blue one shows atmospheric CO2 concentrations as measured from trapped air bubbles in the Antarctic ice. As we see it, it is hovering around 250 parts per million for those 800,000 years. Below, the red line shows Antarctic temperatures as inferred by the same samples. The correlation is pretty clear, and the science is univocal on the causal relations of CO2 and temperatures. Now let us add the latest measurement of atmospheric CO2 concentrations and add a line to represent that to change. This is the measurement from December 21. It's already up to almost 420 parts per million, and you see the red line furthest to the right on top of the blue. As can be seen in the far right, it shoots up rather abruptly. The last 50 years, they kind of don't register on the x-axis of 800,000 units. You know, the hockey stick has emerged. Now let's extend this further, imagining worst case scenarios, even if the Paris goals are met. Now, if we do the same for the below temperature graph, we can see the temperature shooting up way out of sync with the preceding 800,000 years. Now, such abrupt and drastic changes as we are witnessing now requires a truly resilient Earth system to be able to cope. Drawing here on resilience thinking and the adaptive cycle often named after the Canadian ecologist Crawford Holling, Stephanie Wakefield postulates that the Holocene state of equilibrium of the Earth system, here, is being decisively pushed towards a rather uncertain Anthropocene state, here, characterized by a question mark. Where our Earth is heading is altogether uncertain, as we leave the stable climatic conditions of the Holocene that has fostered human civilization as we know it. Next services remain elusive, as pointed out here, for our mobile Earth, here depicted. The old man forging ahead, thanking heavens for the fact that the kids have gadgets that distract them and keep them occupied as he careens into the unknown. But then again, the Earth per se doesn't care. The Earth as this planet in space, our only known planet that can sustain us, is not doing so in its entirety, and life will go on. Ours is merely an existence on a thin crust we can call the critical zone. The big issues of climate change and biodiversity loss really matter only in this thin veneer of the Earth's crust that is critical to our existence. So when I evoke the term earthly attachment, it is really to that green space in the middle there that I'm referring, and all that comes with it. It is on this crust we have enacted the myth of progress, premised on the madness of our economic reason. And examples abound the world over. Here, less than 100 kilometers to the east of our originally proposed venue in Akureyri, we have a wonderful enactment of our post-war growth fetish. The Krafla geothermal power station, built into the flanks of an erupting volcano in the late 70s. The original rationale was to help diversify the Icelandic economy away from fish towards that of heavy industry, aluminium smelters in particular. The 3 aluminium smelters in operation now in Iceland, along with a couple of other factories, indeed today suck up 85% of all energy generated in the country. Being geothermal, it is promoted with a double coating of progress, not only catapulting Iceland, the economy, onto the international market of metal exchange, but doing it for the sake of the planet. Green energy for the aluminium industry. Indeed, in crisis, there is opportunity, as they say. And in sustaining the myth of progress and the madness of indefinite growth, we do indeed have a global intellectual and professional technocracy, which has spurred a frantic search for smart, sustainable, resilient, and/or adaptive socio-ecological management, and seeks out the socio-ecological qualities of eco-development, retrofitting, inclusive governance, and making of new interspecies ecotopes, geoengineering, and technologically innovative, but fundamentally market-conforming eco-design in making for the good Anthropocene. So whilst hoping for a good Anthropocene, an unease is present, at least in the mind of Erik Swingedouw here. He worries that it might indeed turn out to be obscene. And indeed, uncertainty prevails. Wakefield's question mark around the Anthropocene is very present in our minds. And we see that the dreams and aspirations of the good life the post-war generation was brought up with is being thwarted. We know that many things have to change, and the givens of the post-war growth cannot persist. The hockey sticks of the great acceleration need to be broken. And it is in this context that Bruno Latour tries to call us down to earth, while observing with anguish that the universal condition today entails living in the ruins of modernization, groping for a dwelling place. Groping for dwelling amidst the ruins of our post-war aspirations. The tattered landscapes of Krafla volcano, whereby almost alien-looking pipes have latched onto the surface, sucking up energy from below. One does not have to be an expert of sci-fi to see the dystopian imagery here evoked. Yet at the same time, these are ruins of our making, an earth of our making for us. In concluding her book on the mushroom at the end of the world, Anna Tsing tells us that the ruin glares at us with the horror of its abandonment. It is not easy to know how to make a life, much less avert planetary destruction. But luckily there is still company, human and not human. We can still explore the overgrown verges of our blasted landscapes, the edges of capitalist discipline, scalability, and abandoned resource plantation. We can still catch the scent of the latent commons and the elusive autumn aroma. The latent commons. The elusive aroma that hold the future potential, the conditions of future presencing. indeed we can see beyond the myth of progress. We see the future through the ruin and images of catastrophe. And although it is not a pretty sight, it is indeed one that needs to be reckoned with. So part 3, a promise revived. Facing the ruins of our making and looking for conditions of future therein. Here I evoke the earthly attachment. And we can recognize these as becomings of earth and society together, which may help us probe the richly layered formations we have inherited from the overlooked, marginalized, or as yet unactualized geosocial possibilities murmuring within them. The image here is from a similar facility as Krafla, the Svartsengi power station and its adjacent Blue Lagoon near the Keflavík airport, where the volcano of Fagradalsfjall is now actually erupting. You might have seen it. No, probably not. You're at home. Well, anyway, it shows how we have extended our fingers into the critical zone, probed the earth, and come up with possibilities. First, purely in search of energy, but with surprising results, precipitating what my good colleague Erd J. Jonsson calls geothermal living. Indeed, next to the blasted verges of the geothermal Krafla energy facility sit the Mývatn nature baths, drawing on the original geothermal wells drilled on the site. Much like the Blue Lagoon, and actually owned now by the Blue Lagoon, these baths allow for Epicurean delights and ways of living with hot water that has transformed Icelandic culture and society, never intended for by those trying to harness the geothermal sources for growth and progress. As Georg Simmel explained a century ago, the ruin here strikes us often as tragic, but not as sad, because destruction here is not something senselessly coming from the outside, but rather a realization of a tendency inherent in the deepest layer of existence of the destroyed. The unactualized, murmuring geosocial possibilities. The tendency inherent in our earth writing, what it means when we face up being one with the earth, making for it as it makes for us, we can expose those deepest layers of existence, latent aroma, and unactualized geosocial possibilities. And we are in good company, as Anna Zinger reminds us. So many things we take for granted and assume inert have a role to play. And my personal favorite therein are rocks, stones, pebbles. And I really like how the geologist Marcia Björnerud describes them. Rocks, they're not nouns, but verbs, visible evidence of processes. Her particular focus on deep geological time helps us appreciate just how the Earth's temporal flow come together. To me, rocks hold deep time, affording you a connection deep into the mist of time and at the same time deep into the crust of the Earth. Indeed, Marcia wants us to take time into account when we think about the Earth and its systems in crisis, adopting timefulness to appreciate how all things come to pass at their own time in their own rhythms, how thinking like a geologist can help save the world. Now, so what about tourism? That instant gratification through experience that we all see, which Harvey sees as one of the prime motors of the global economy at current and prime example of the madness of our economic reasoning. Is this a mad spectacularization of a view to be snapped, uploaded and shared with the tagline, "Been there, done that"? Or is this simply a selfie moment? Me and Mother Earth rocking away. A quick sweep of social media posts around those two locations will mostly actually confirm that. But there is more. These are places affording a connection to the rocks themselves. The billion-year-old granite of Trolltunga and the surrounding mountains is remarkable, as is the fresh basaltic lava gushing from the fissure near Fagradalsfjall here depicted. Encountering these can be conceived of as so much more than spectacularized ends. They can be seen as becomings, nuptials, their movements, lines, flows of differing speeds and durations. An encounter poses their problems, It can reconfigure identities, spaces, and political economy, reminds Usman Barua. The rhythms of rock formation are so different, yet part and parcel of this earth that makes for us as we make for it. Encountering stones, once there, holds a particular transformative allure, and we have most certainly made use of these throughout our history. As such, the very stone we stand on as we gaze at the two sides of Trolltunga or Fagradalsfjall, we are so prone to spectacularize. These are stones that can endure. They can change, they can harm, they can heal. They can make you rich, they can make you poor. They can make you an enemy, a friend, and a teacher. You can carry your memories and your dreams, build empires or bury cities. You can reveal the history of the universe, open and close the gates of philosophy, or change the course of nature even. They can change their own nature, and moreover, they can empty the world of time. And this is the way I like to think about a particular destination that has for some years been in development in the far northeast corner of Iceland. The Arctic hedge at Raufarhöfn, through its very materiality, can empty the world of time. In other words, afford you that connection to deep time. Following Hugh Raffles further, these standing stones at the Arctic henge invite speculation, demand it even, but they offer few answers to the questions they pose. Only material remains, summoning archaeopoetics from archaeologists, just as it summons geopoetics from geologists and poetic poetics from poets, all gathering up the millennia to apprehend life from these and other stones. Apprehending life from these and other stones, he says. And indeed, stones, they don't speak, no more than the earth does. They don't provide answers, yet they will always be with you, an enemy, a friend, and a teacher. So back to Krafla. And here, visiting the site of the original experimental boreholes from the late 50s that made for the eventual power station. These boreholes were left there, stones piled on top of them, and still to date, hissing steam reaches the surface, inviting speculation on our earthly attachments and indeed making for a major tourist attraction. Judy Natal's artwork, entitled indeed Future Perfect, is from that very site. Evoked in the Timothy Morton's book on hyperobjects, whereby he tries to make sense of the earth and its systems as elusive yet present, mostly hidden from view as the iceberg. The point to be underlined is that we are one with this earth, and as Nigel Clark and colleagues point out in the context of Krafla, to break through the earth's crust and make contact with the vast churning forces beneath is surely a kind of violence, but it must also be seen as an engagement with an earth that is, in its own way, non-self-identical, an astronomical body that constantly, sometimes catastrophically, breaks with its own integrity. Much like the Earth system, we are a system in relation and certain equilibrium. We mostly know what can upset our delicate balance, like for instance viruses and such, but we are only fumbling in the dark to understand how that extends to the Earth system as a whole. But here comes the rub. Now, it is all fine and well to talk about us as relational beings and assign agency to all things material and immaterial, and see us as merely nodes in the endless actor networks of being. Following practices and doings and looking at the world sideways is a fun thought exercise. But in the end of the day, it is us, through our deliberations, stories we tell, myths we create, and meaning we make for, that are making for the earth as it makes for us. My colleague Bram Buscher spares no punches when he reminds us that acknowledging certain forms of human exceptionalism is no impediment to recognizing more than human relations. Regardless of what he labels the non-human term, he claims we have to place ourselves firmly within the dialectical tension that the co-constitution of nature and society represents, which is almost an epistemological, analytical, and political balancing act that responds to forces of power and other interrelationships. In other words, precisely because we make for the earth and it makes for us, we need to distinguish between the different elements at play to meaningfully understand the relations that constitute their interrelation. The key question to emerge then is how and why we are tangled with this earth. And here is where I see the future possibilities of tourism and ways in which we can shape mobile futures. Through travel and the encounter, we can revive the promise of tourism through responsibility, reciprocity, and conviviality. In the American indigenous tradition of braiding sweetgrass, Robin Wall Kimmerer calls for our responsibilities as human people to find ways to enter into reciprocity with more than human world. We can do this through gratitude, through ceremony, through land stewardship, through science, art, and in the everyday acts of practical reverence. This is our responsibility not only for the more than human world, but also that of others. And this is the true promise of tourism in my mind. An idea of conviviality, resting on the gift and surprise that is the other, that can only wander in when that space is open. Foreclosing tourism and destinations as spectacular experiences to be ticked off the bucket list, feeding the hubris of growth, cannot go on. We need to recognize us as of this earth and spawned of the relations forged through encounters with others and the more than human. We need to wrest the image of tourism from the hands of modernizing grandstanders, most recently manifest in the Sustainable Development Goals, meant to as a generic recipe for human emancipation. As opposed to that, we need to think through conviviality. Conviviality resting immensely on the imaginative potential of the individual and the everyday use of tools, rather than premised on a political mass mobilization or institutional territories of anti-industrial resistance. It is through the individual rediscovery of everyday life and tools that we begin to imagine convivial commonwealth alternatives to industrialism, cultivated and vitalized as social challenges to industrial forms of life. Our modern day tourism economy is premised on the fictitious commodity of life and the mediating of experiences. We have become so adept at believing in competition and survival in face of scarcity as parameters of life that we have made it true in our own society, but moreover transposed this largely to understanding ecosystem dynamics. Tourism is an emblematic industry of our current madness of economic reason. We can produce endless ideas of how to remedy the global industry with blanket measures such as the Sustainable Development Goals. And yes, we should try doing that. But at the same time, I want to highlight the stories that rocks and steam can tell us. How these can create spaces of conviviality, of geothermal living. How rocks help us create stories of other ways of being and doing. How they can make the everyday a spectacular experience we all have access to, even in our backyard. And thereby, how our mobile futures do not only have to be about transporting the sack of meat and bones we are, but can also be about flights of fancy. The stories we tell matter. They have transformed the earth to the extent that it is talking back. And what that means, we will only be able to appreciate from a future perfect we make for now from the ruins of modernity. So in terms of shaping mobile futures and the challenges and possibilities in precarious times, I want to talk about the scrumpled spaces of conviviality, wherein alternative worldviews can be forged and gain hold, clouding the default glasses of the growth imperative we all don. The burgeoning alternative movements around the world seem never to last, because they remain mostly invisible or hidden in the blind spots of the modern constitution. When we are getting real about climate change by adopting the language of governance and getting to the 1.5 degrees, we are dismissing all the ways in which we can reconceive life and being together. So in terms of tourism and the scrumpled spaces of conviviality, I say we emphasize radical hospitality versus formalized service, the latter overlooking the carnality of being. I say that we accept that we can be powerless to avoid enslaving and debilitating perfectionism of all relations. I claim we can rely on our own creative energies and desires, an experimental form of everydayness through carnal participation, recognizing that we are homo narrans, we tell stories. And we need to allow for a multiplicity of practices, cultivating the art of paying attention to the possible, honoring divergence, and alloy differences based on what people make matter. We are relational beings, and we need to allow for that, be it out on Trolltunga or in the virtual reception here afterwards. Being open to being relational, however, cannot come at the cost of taking responsibility of the forcefulness of our being. The stories we tell and how we make sense of the world most certainly matters. So what stories are we going to tell about mobile futures in our precarious times? The story I'm going to tell is about conviviality, looking for the possible in the everyday dealings with our current dire predicament of climate change and biodiversity loss, where I claim being mobile can also be about staying put. And with that, I thank you for your attention.